So I guess Lisa couldn't make it. She got caught at the airport, according to Mark, and she was going to chair this committee. So I will lead it off here as one of the committee chairs. The purpose of this committee is really to work on data and metrics to link that with our overall work with the STEM strategy and other things that we're working on. And so this subcommittee was formed to really focus on getting a little more clarity on what those key metrics and outcomes and data that we're going to need as we go forward. So I think we've got a pretty interesting agenda for the day, and Mark's going to take us through that. First, we should do some introductions so we get everyone on the same page as here. So, John, you want to start?
John Taponia, President of Echo Northwest.
A man with lots of data, lots of information. Jim Cairo, Portland General.
Brenda Turner, Oregon Employment Department.
Laura McCoy, the Director of Oregon Career Information System.
Mike Rebar, Oregon Education Investment Board, Director of Systems Integration.
Hi, I'm Chrissy Hewitt. I'm a research analyst with the Oregon Education Investment Board.
And I'm Mark Lewis. I'm the Director of STEM for the Oregon Education Investment Board and the Chief Education Officer.
Why don't we introduce yourself?
Luis Morez from CCWD.
Jerry Anable from the Portland Metro STEM Partnership.
And Jerry? Yeah, you're supposed to be at the table as part of this
You've been promoted.
official committee member.
Yes, you've been
I'm sorry.
We don't have a name tag.
I know.
Only the members,
Yeah.
the real members.
Maureen Falk from PGE.
Joe Oshiro from Oregon Department of Education.
And on the phone?
Anyone on the phone?
This is Dietrich Steinmetz from Portland Community College Science and Engineering Division.
Great.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Dietrich. So as the chair pointed out, the purpose of this subcommittee, which is one of three subcommittees of the STEM Investment Council, the other two being one to advance the work of the strategic plan for STEM. That's meeting its second time tomorrow, is really on a sprint to get a draft out to the field. The other subcommittee is going to be on communications and advocacy, and there's a lot of additional work that's is needed prior to going into the next legislative session to look at common messaging around STEM, making the justification and for why this is important and needs legislative support. The governor has put forward $14 million in his budget to support the various STEM strategies that the STEM Investment Council put forward as recommendations to the OEIB. And so we're very, very happy to receive that level of support from him. And this is really around three tiers of investment. So this is to lay some groundwork here and background to our work. One is to really support the regional STEM hubs and a statewide network of STEM hubs which act as a critical infrastructure piece to find local solutions to local needs. If those STEM hubs are partnerships between diverse stakeholder groups from workforce, economic development, K-12, community colleges, four-year institutions, out-of-school STEM providers, economic development, civic leaders, really with the notion that education is a collective responsibility and that we need to, in order to get the outcomes that we need for students, we need to be everybody bringing their talent to the table in those efforts. And so we're very pleased about that. And also then knowing that different STEM hubs have a different expertise. And so while their work is localized, the hows and the whys become shared across the system as a whole, so we can accelerate changes in the system. The other investments are on the post-secondary space and how do we encourage greater responsiveness in our post-secondary environment to changing workforce demand. How do we make a more direct connection between supply and demand so that at least part of our education system is more demand driven than it has been previously. And so building off of the model of the Engineering Technology Industry Council is the notion, the idea of that and the success of that effort. but then how do we expand it to more of the high demand, high wage career areas, such as manufacturing, such as healthcare industry or biomedical industries, such as agribusiness, mechatronics, other places that are rapidly growing. And in addition, expanding it to also support the community college structure so that those are also receiving necessary supports to be responsive in terms of programming and graduates. Then there's another STEM activities or program activities that was recommended by the STEM Investment Council, and this is to how do we find and identify those highly effective programs and spread them, and then also how do we take a more deliberate and intentional look, similar to how one might invest from a business perspective, from a Shark Tank, let's say, kind of idea. You've got some really good ideas that seem to demonstrate promise. Okay, let's provide some incentive funding to get those off the ground, but let's pay really close attention to the return on the investment there, and being able to honor the things that don't work just as much as the things that do work, and then utilize the infrastructure that's being built with the STEM folks, the interpersonal infrastructure that's being built there, not in terms of buildings necessarily, but the human interactions, and use that network then to spread those ideas that are showing great evidence more rapidly. So those are the three investments. Please join us at the table.
Up at the front.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you are right at the table.
That's what you get for coming in late, right?
We have to do
Punished for fashionably late.
Actually, and Elizabeth, perhaps you can identify yourself as well as Brian, too.
I'm Elizabeth Cox-Brand. I'm the Director of Student Success and Assessment for the Oregon Community College Association. I know most of you.
Yeah, that's right.
Brian Fox, City University Budget and Finance for the hack.
So thank you for that. So the charge of this subcommittee will be really to do a couple of different things. One, I believe that this subcommittee needs to be some of the questioners in chief, if you will. So what do we really care about, right? What's important for us to look at? What is the state of the current state of the system that we're trying to change? When the strategic planning work starts to move forward to the what are we trying to change, there's got to be a lot of interaction between this subcommittee and the strategic planning subcommittee. And then how will we provide evidence that we're making a difference? What are those indicators that we're going to be utilizing to do so? We have real challenges ahead, and not only because of the state of the data systems and the kinds of data that we currently collect. I mean, we're drowning in them on the one hand, but there's significant limitations to some of those data sets. There's data sets that haven't been tapped, to my knowledge, yet that we might be able to leverage. And then there's some definitional aspects that I think that we have to we need to put forward some definitions to enable us to analyze those data sets in a way that is consistent over time. And the definitions that I think that we need to ask ourselves, because the goal of the STEM Council that's been put forward in legislation is twofold. One, to double the number of STEM degrees by 2025. So, to bring into alignment with the conversations that are happening at the HEC, the STEM Investment Council has interpreted that to be degrees and certificates and industry-recognized credentials. We can certainly get clarification from the legislature on that, but that seems to be the intent from what our current read is on that. So what is a STEM degree is the obvious question. And are all STEM degrees created equal?
Mm-hmm.
So those are tough questions. They may sound simple, but they're not. The other goal of the STEM Investment Council is to double the achievement in math and science at 4th and 8th grade on nationally normed tests.
And just because those are minimums, those aren't.
Those are minimums. Yes,
This is
these are
clear.
the legislated goals
Yeah.
currently.
We can take it out, we set it for new
Yeah. These are the minimum goals put
We could do more
forward.
if we wanted to. You know?
And our strategic plan that we will be developing will get much more precise about the various goals that we're trying to achieve. Anywhere from, if we look at, walking back from a STEM degree, when we decide on what that means, we are going to actually be needing to wrestle with aspects of capacity within the system, right? Is there capacity in our post-secondary institutions to do that? And in what sectors? What are issues in terms of the number of students of color who are there disparities in gender or race in that makeup of those who are getting STEM degrees, certificates, or industry credentials? What strategies and approaches actually are effective to retain people in their studies to attain those degrees? What does our applicant pool look like in terms of actual enrollments in those STEM programs? How do we increase student interest further upstream? How do we utilize STEM to increase graduation rates?
Are you just
What?
making stuff up now? Or are you
No,
just all
I've
over
been
the
thinking about
place?
this for a long,
Like, come
long
on,
time.
Mark,
I have a
we got
whole
an hour
list,
and a half here.
and later on, you'll notice in number 5 is I want us to start laying out additional questions and really doing some brainstorming, because I believe it's the questions that we ask that are going to be the most important, because then we can start gathering data and evidence to help us answer that and to help the STEM Investment Council answer some of those questions. So I will stop there, because I can walk up further into even preschool and early educational experiences in early childhood that I believe have a very profound impact on our achievement gap and opportunity gap for our students of color as well. So, but we don't need to go there right now. Another piece of this work, just to let you be aware of it, we have begun conversations to create a cross-institutional research consortium, STEM Education Research Consortium in the state. So getting the Portland State University, getting OSU, getting University of Oregon, getting our private colleges who are doing educational research to hopefully begin to align their research programs with the practices and programs that are being implemented out into the field. So what we would love to do is to start aligning those efforts. To what extent does out-of-school time participation in STEM programs impact one's STEM identity or their motivation to pursue a STEM career? Great question. OSU has been looking at that for some time. John Falk and Lynn Dierkine there. So how do we align those efforts with how do we change teacher instructional practices around mathematics and science so that students are less traumatized by the mathematical experiences that they have, and which we reduce then our need for developmental mathematics. So these are really, and to some extent there's national research that points to some ideas around that, and there's other places where there's really pretty substantial gaps in that research base. But having this cross-institutional research consortium would help this committee then also answer questions that arise. So I see a real strong dynamic between these various pieces of the puzzle that we've got in place here. And it's very, very exciting for me to see that. The key will be to make sure that we get enough cross-pollination not just a single point of pollination, so that information flows well. I'm going to pause there and see if there's questions about what our charge may or may not be.
One of the questions that I have is, just in terms of what you were talking about, is very much program of study specific. And I know that's how STEM used to be, or has previously been defined as program of study. And I wondered, is the idea to expand that, which is a much more recent evolution, to occupational pursuits?
So a program of study within the career and technical education, STEM is identified as a particular program of study. Outside of the career and technical education field, people have the STEM movement, if you will, across the nation has not been tied to the career and technical education's definitions of a program of study and STEM. So this is one of the challenges that we face as well, is this bifurcation of STEM and CTE. Within the system as a whole, the education system, there's a perception of career and technical education largely as vocational. There's still notions of it being around vocational and the trades. That has largely, less than kind of view is perpetuated still, while at the same time career and technical education has advanced substantially in how it's actually being done. But the perception problem still exists. We have perception problems still existing in terms of the 40-40-20, if you will, as well, where we perceive a middle 40, even putting it in that term seems to convey there's an upper 40 and a middle 40 and a lower. So I think that that's something that the council has recognized is something that we need to at least be acknowledging these perceptions, and how do we move beyond them in a way that values and moves people more towards, look, this is really about a number of different things. It's about high demand, high wage earning career opportunities that drive economic growth here in the state of Oregon. It's about not just filling jobs, but creating jobs. It's about resolving inequities in terms of an equity lens and diversity issues around that. So we've got a lot of pieces there. It's also about transforming our education system so that we actually, it's about student engagement. We know that those who are part of hands-on learning opportunities, such as offered as career and technical education, graduate at a rate of 89% here in the state. That's just in Oregon. Nationally, it's something like 93% for those who are participating in programs of study from a hands-on environment, whereas our graduation rate in Oregon is 68%. So it provides a real opportunity that I see STEM as really being able to achieve the 40-40-20, to achieve at least maybe not 100% graduation rate, but 95% graduation rate or 94% graduation rate, I think is infinitely doable. But it means that we need to be challenging some assumptions here. Does that? I went broad on you.
No,
sorry. Really.
I'd say
and it doesn't take much.
I'd say bluntly, they're connected very closely. CTE and STEM
Yeah, they're
are very
very
closely
But even
connected.
outside the scope of STEM, I guess one of the things I'm thinking about, the employment department and CIS, both we match what we present in our systems. And we have lists of occupations that are determined or defined as STEM that are very closely related to specific programs of study. And so I was just thinking if we were going to bridge that gap from what you described as very program of study specific, and I just wondered if this particular task force was also going to be looking at occupations.
Yes, absolutely.
Taxonomies.
I think that one of the very first tasks that we should be considering as a subcommittee is to look at those definitional aspects and to highlight some of or bring greater awareness. We've got our occupation codes. We've also got the work that is done from the education perspective in terms of classification with SIP codes. Yeah, SIP and SOC.
That's right.
and yet we also know, having delved into some of those SOC codes, that that we may need to go actually to the ONET databases and definitions to actually answer some of these questions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ONET, we'll get there. But and I use this example, I think with John, is an economics degree is in most instances not classified as a STEM degree. And yet, when you look at the necessary skill sets required to be successful as an economist, there's an awful lot of mathematical modeling and analytics that goes into it. And,
Yeah.
and in terms of their undergraduate degree, 80% is
Oh, yeah, no.
is all of that.
A lot of
Fourier
programmers in my
transforms
office.
and yeah, exactly. So our traditional definitions may not hold up, and we as a state have an opportunity to define what that means. And it's playing out on the national stage. People are wrestling with this, and largely they have fallen into the traditional categories right now because people get into this muddle and they go, well, how are we going to do that? The challenge then becomes in a lot of our reporting in the news, well, we have enough STEM graduates in our system already to fill the need. Well, if you look at it in one way, yes. If you look at it in another way, it's completely inadequate. So what is the lens that we're going to be bringing to the data? Which data are we going to be putting forward so that we can make an argument that really reflects reality? If we look from an employment department, how much talent are we importing for those STEM occupations? That tells us something about the marketability, anyway, of STEM degrees or the availability of local supply, if you will. Right, so that's the kind of thing that we need to be getting into. So yes, we're going to dive into those codes, and probably I would recommend that would be one of our first tasks of our next subcommittee meeting would be to go deep into those and start framing some of this out. Because without those definitions, it's really hard, and yet it's hard because that's part of how we are messaging and how we message and tell our story to the legislature. There's a growing desire, I think, to perhaps, rather than get into these definitional pieces, say, what are the high-wage, high-demand jobs? And that we can get a lot greater clarity on. Shall I go another gray place? Is the matching of SIP and SOC codes. So we don't have one-to-one correspondence between somebody getting a particular degree and the jobs that they fill. And yet we see studies of people who have STEM degrees believe that they're employed in a field of study related to their degree. I have an aeronautical engineering degree. I'm obviously not in the aeronautical engineering field. Is it valuable for my role? Heck yeah, right? So these are some of the other definitional challenges that people get into when you read the news, you can see the swirl around it.
Well, don't we care more about getting the degrees and let the graduates figure out where they want to go? I mean, I don't know if we can go. I mean, it's nice to know where the jobs are and where the opportunities are, and we can lay that out because we want to fill the demand. But at the end of the day, people are going to choose after they graduate from college what they want to do. If we get them there with a degree, they'll find what their passion is, and I don't think we can be prescriptive and say, now you're an engineer, you have to go be an engineer. I mean,
of course not.
I mean, right. And we're not going to. I mean, whether they go there or not is their own personal preference. The fact is, they got the degree and they have a capability and skill set. Hopefully, they fill a niche in the economy that adds value. So,
yeah. So I would, sort of coming fresh off a lot of these conversations with the universities, I would think that we need to look at a couple different things. There's a tactical approach to meeting short-term labor force demand need. That's largely how I see CTE education. Maybe I'm off there, but we can work through that. For the degree, for sort of university degrees, I think it's much more a dive into a long-term skill set development that could flex through the labor market over time. And I think that that's something that we need to be thoughtful of. And I think this gets to what's an economics degree, really. It's sort of this core mathematics. What's that really? It's a core logical reasoning skill set. That's the added value in the education process that applies throughout the career path. So those are the pieces that we need to be thoughtful of. And not hemming it too much on short-term tactical career-oriented in some areas, right? So there's a balance.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Although CTE was also a pathway rather than just a, supply and demand. It's also, like you said, about engagement and, getting into maybe one of those STEM
But I think we need to start clarifying language, right? I mean, there's a whole lot getting thrown around here without a whole lot of clarity, and so we need to start to
It
manage
depends
that.
where that CT is. If it's in the community college, it tends to be more career directed.
Yeah.
Where at middle school and high school, it's mostly
It's-
development.
Unless
Yeah,
it's
exactly. It's like a
dual credit and
discovery.
they're taking
Yeah.
it at a
Discovery
community
and learning,
college,
and some of them go
Yeah.
all the way to BCT, and others go into engineering, and some just go back to something else. So I think it's depending on where you're talking about.
Right.
So where it is.
Yeah. So, are there other questions right now? This is going to be a really fascinating committee, and I want to put out there that our conversations, we will need to, again, allow our questions to frame our conversations, because we can go so many different places here. So it's going to be important for us to identify get some clarity on what are we trying to answer, and use that.
Let me throw one other thing out there. We're going to have to think about this is you can't do this in 1 year because it is a life of learning. And so just because you put a program in today, you're not going to necessarily be able to measure the outcomes. It's going to take a long... So we're going to have longitudinal databases to
Yes.
watch and see how children progress through the system, and are we making a difference in their education. Just because they got exposed to something doesn't mean, and there's natural premonition to do things. I mean, when I think about it, this is not just a snapshot in time and you're done. And
Yeah.
you do a program and you can evaluate and say, oh, it did this, because it's going to take years of exposure to these kinds of different teaching mechanisms and different exposures to see if they actually change the trajectory of STEM degrees. So,
Good point. We'll need to be looking short-term and long-term.
yeah.
And there's some things that we will need to take care of short-term fairly rapidly,
Right.
so that we can move the work forward. So prioritizing our conversation so we can advance the work. Absolutely. Okay. John, do you want to give us a snapshot of we'll get the data up here. And, I've asked John and Brendan to give us at least a quick overview of the supply and demand situation as it exists, just to actually get us... Oh, thanks, Zach.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Send it.
Education careers.
You really should. You're better than Sam.
All right. So these set of data were prepared in some of the conversations leading up to the release of the governor's budget, and the governor's budget had a piece on education careers as one of the three main education sort of strategic foci, and clearly intersected with this group's thinking. We took a relatively quick dive, so I'd say this is the very first pass without ever then going back and picking at it, and so there's an awful lot of good additional picking and poking and prodding of these data that are well justified. So the very first thing we did, this question that Mark had at the very beginning, which is legislature said we're going to double the number of STEM degrees by 2025. A good question would be, how many do we have now? What would you double to? To that point,
Number of people in
You're
the
good.
so,
And so the debate begins
Right
right
away.
away.
Right, exactly. So this will get us right into the definitions, et cetera. Yeah, right. So we dove into the IPEDS database, which is a federal repository that many institutions across the United States send information to. with these SIP codes, which stands for
Classification
Instructional Program, right. And as far as we could tell, you could get pretty consistent data back to 2002 through 2013. And folks we were having conversations with back in the day were interested in sort of three broad groups. They were interested in the STEM category, they were interested in trades, and they were interested in health professions. And I don't have the SIP taxonomy in front of me, but I will say that STEM is defined in the way that, and you'd be shocked to hear where you would get this, somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about how to define it, is the Immigration and Control Service, because they have to decide whether or not they're going to have people come in on. So they had to sit down and figure out for their purposes of awarding visas and that kind of thing what STEM meant to them.
No, there's 2 or 3 other national definitions as well. Department of Labor has one, as well as I believe Immigration and NSF has one.
Right. So this is the immigration one. It's very close to the immigration one. There are, and I'm sorry I didn't have the taxonomy in front of us, but they are the most likely characters that you would have. It's the physical sciences, math and statistics, and the like. It does not include social sciences, or it has the computer and the engineering pieces, obviously. I think the immigration folks went off the reservation and just maybe in a couple of narrow pieces that were related to military things and whatnot, but it was very narrow. They were pretty clean in there.
How about software programmers?
They would be in here.
Okay.
Yep. It's sort of computer science and technicians, and it gets down into certificate activity, etc. Then in terms of the other pieces here, the health professions is one broad category of health professions that we took. There was something else that had health in it that we didn't take. But there is one broad health profession that has many, many, many details in it. And then the trades, there were 3 sort of down toward the bottom of the table that one of them had the word trade in it, another one is production, and a third one. So that's what we have here. So then, so now just sort of looking at it, this is what is spit out for Oregon institutions, Oregon degree granting institutions that supply information to the IPED system. So if you don't supply information to the IPED system, you're not in this.
So that's public and private.
Public and private.
College.
Yep.
And for profits.
And
If you receive Title IV federal funding, you report to IPEDS.
There you go. But in industry certifications and such would not be in this.
Right.
So if we believe, and again, there's been no auditing, no sort of what's going on with this trend kind of analysis. It looks like STEM sort of bumped up there between 2008 and 2013. So at least as a first pass, that's kind of promising. And depending on when we decided we were going to double it, we could either say we're trying to double it from
2002.
2012.
5,500 or okay. Right.
2014, 2015 baseline.
Yeah.
I just read it.
But in any event, if we were to believe these numbers as they come spitting out of iPads, certainly moving in the right direction with respect to those. And then you'd want to dig in and sort of see specifically what kind of degrees are we talking about.
So an interesting question here is this is not just Oregon students, this is anyone who graduates. So
And that's an important distinction, Jim, because we do walk around with 2 different kinds of data. We do have a longitudinal database that would allow us to follow Oregon high school graduates wherever they go and figure out whether or not they earn STEM degrees anywhere. But this information are institutions that are on the soil of Oregon granting degrees to people.
So the question we need to ask ourselves is the metric increasing STEM degrees for Oregonians, doubling that, or just increasing STEM degrees in the state? I would think it's the Oregonians, but I don't know if wasn't that clear in the legislature, was it, Mark?
It isn't.
But I would think this is supposed to be focused at Oregonians, and if an Oregonian gets a STEM degree in Washington, at University of Washington, that's
Or
a good
MIT.
outcome.
Yeah.
Or MIT, or that's what we're trying to accomplish. I don't think we're worried about people in Michigan who come to Oregon State necessarily, but we just need to. We're going to have to make
Yeah.
that decision down the road. It's a
Resident.
question we have to ask.
So if they have resident status, maybe, because if you come just for your college career, then you wouldn't have, you'd be a non-resident.
be a
So
non-resident.
you'd be able to classify them.
So you could track. I don't know if the data tracks residents versus non-residents.
So there's
Well,
potential for taking out two sets of people: the Oregonians who move out of state to get their STEM degrees, right?
Right.
Potentially
Yeah.
removed or included, and the other one is people coming to study in Oregon who are graduated from Oregon institutions with STEM degrees.
So I want to push a little bit. I think that there's a fundamental question in play, which is this focused on what we do for our kids, or is this focused on how we develop the labor markets in Oregon? Because those are two very different questions that may lead to very different answers.
You also need to understand that many times kids get an education someplace else but go back to their home state.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
So do the people stay here that you educate? So that's
Yeah.
maybe the third question. We may educate them here with a STEM degree, but if they go to California, that doesn't help our state either.
And that speaks to is the economy prepared to accept folks? So there is an economic piece of creating the demand for those degrees.
We hear from Intel, and we heard it many times from Jill, it says that we can get the people we want, we just don't get them from Oregon.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
I mean, we get the best and brightest from other colleges, universities. So that's a great question, and we need to figure out what it is we're trying to measure.
So I'm trying to capture these. So one of the data, so that's a critical question for us to address at some point here. The other question is how much talent do we import? Is that for that labor market? Is that the question or not?
I don't know if that's one that I'd put at the very top of the list to do an investigation on, but
Interesting side note.
I think just fundamentally, it's Jim's question. When we're talking about doubling degree earners, are we looking at an institution focus of Oregon institutions and their production, or are we looking at the production of individuals who graduated from Oregon high schools, wherever they may have collected their STEM degree, anywhere in the United States? Or both?
Yeah.
I think we have to do both.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of value in both sides of that equation.
There might be a question, which is what you were trying to get to, which is how many of those graduates stay here in Oregon?
Right.
Of all these STEM
Which is-
degrees,
That's something the
Sure,
employment
yeah,
department
what's-
can ultimately help us with a little bit, I think, is with longitudinal data, bang it up against your database to see how many of them are working in Oregon.
I don't think it would be very good to help. I mean, maybe it's good. We educate a bunch of kids, get STEM degrees, and they all leave the state.
Right.
That doesn't really help economic development.
Yeah.
Good for the universities, which isn't a bad thing, but it's not
Yeah.
for the state.
Exactly. So now just the balance board tables that follow are simply numbers that fall out of those lines that you've just seen. And again, with no poking, prodding, auditing, etc. So consider this sort of a first pass. These are post-secondary STEM awards as roughly defined by the Immigration Service. 2002 to 2013, certificates, associates, bachelors, masters, doctors, private and public institutions over time.
Can you give some examples of certificate programs that qualify as STEM in this?
Right. So, like engineering technician, there's a whole SIP category of.
Yes. So it's a sub-baccalaureate.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, and you're seeing quite a few of them pile up there. So again, that is something that, those 846 of them in 2013, we could disaggregate that little number easily and tell you all the different flavors of that.
So an interesting question on the data. Do we care if we count someone 3 times in the degree? I mean, you could get your associate, you can get your bachelor degree, and next year or 2 years you get your master's degree, and next year you get your doctorate degree. It could just be one person. And I don't know if that's important to our data or not.
Or you get a bachelor's degree, you come back to get a certificate to up your skills.
Oh, that might be it too. Yeah, so there's
You already have a bachelor's degree.
Happens.
Going back.
Yeah.
Happens a lot.
So are we
Yeah.
only counting terminal degree?
Yeah. That's the question.
Or,
Right. Out of
Yeah.
these data, you'd never be able to.
Yeah, you couldn't- I know you couldn't
what was
sort it.
going on. Out of the other data, you could. You could follow them over time and only give yourself credit for the highest degree. So that's the STEM. Now, we had some interest in, out of the STEM, just looking at the engineering alone. So this is a subset of, this is the E. And I had engineering and engineering-related fields, which again, off the top of my head, I don't know exactly what, I forget what those all were. And there you can see that. Engineering, and in the private institution, that is University of Portland, I believe, because I was surprised to find engineering degrees in a private institution.
George Fox as well.
George Fox as well. So that was engineering, and again, sort of a positive, positive story, and certainly a big uptick in those certificates over time. The analyst in me wonders if that's real uptick in certificates or if that's just better reporting as time goes by those institutions. But given how small they are in the beginning. But for goal setting, I would have taken credit for it.
Should we start at 2000?
Awards in health professions, this is the one that probably deserves the most attention. I don't know where the MDs, it's spelled out of iPads, and I'm still relatively new to this one. So where the MDs and the like fall, probably worth a second pass to go back. But I think we did count up all the degrees and put them in some category here. The totals probably make some sense. I don't know if the names on the inside are perfect or not.
John, we've looked at the advanced degrees in National Student Clearinghouse data.
Okay.
And we see advanced degrees significantly underreported.
Oh.
GPs and Ds.
Oh, okay, so they might just be MIA.
Yeah, we're not sure why.
Okay. But again, the idea of pulling in health at all was that this was the occupational argument that the skill is so tightly aligned. That health, and you see other states doing this. Kentucky has a STEM plus health piece. So that's the health. Here are those trades. Oh, and here I've got the names on the bottom. It includes all awards in construction trades, mechanic/repair technologies, and precision production. Those were the 3 broader SIP categories. And of course, there's a whole host of lists of things underneath them, including leather workers and things that we may or may not be excited about, or may or may not even be delivered in Oregon per se. But that's what we got out of the trades. And again, I think those private institutions, that's probably noise as much as anything up there. A handful that were there have disappeared. So that is that out of the IPEDS data. Now I believe we're going to transition to CTE, and this comes from the Oregon Education Department, which keeps track of these statistics for the purposes of federal reporting. And what this is doing is saying, if we start and make this as easy as possible, for the high school class of 2009-10, that high school cohort, if we go all the way over to the right-hand side to the total, that would say of that cohort, 23,351 students, at least sometime in their high school career, touched at least a half a credit of a CTE. So about half of kids at least touched CTE once at some point. And then what this is are mutually exclusive buckets of less than a half a credit, and then the one would be greater than a half a credit, less than or equal to one, and so forth. And so if you get, I believe the term of art is if you take 3 or more, you are a concentrator.
It was just one or more. Is the way Brent and Laura Roach were defining it. Yeah.
Okay, 1 or more. So there's a lot of them, I guess, that would be considered to be concentrators. So there you can see the distribution. And the change as we go through the high school classes, increasing numbers of kids that were taking, a few of these credits, and slightly decreasing numbers of kids who were taking lots of them.
And again, for the way they report their graduation statistics for the concentrator, so 1 or more CTE credits, it's in the mid-80s in terms of the graduation rates. We have to get some definitional there. So those who are taking more, we can surmise that their graduation rates are going up.
With respect to what they are taking, here are all the different flavors of CTE that are offered, and the number of credits earned. Now, this is not for a high school class, it's for just a school year. So these could be freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors. And the red bars are participants, so I guess they're the light touchers. And the gray bars are concentrators. So there you can sort of see all the different ag, architecture, arts, AV, business management, finance, health, hospitality, etc. All the way across until you come to STEM, almost on the right-hand side of the transportation logistics.
What I'm going to do is pass around, Joe, thank you for this, there was a report recently called STEM, or CTE is your STEM strategy, and what it does is attempts to look at all of the various clusters, let's say, ag and food and natural resources, and say within that there's various careers that the CTE world, even though it's named ag, food, and natural resources, they say, well, there's agricultural technician, agricultural engineers, forest and conservation workers, foresters, food science technicians, veterinarians, marine biologists, and water resource specialists that are samples of STEM careers within that classification. So even though they have a separate STEM classification, they acknowledge and recognize that in every single one of those pathways that they are, or programs of study, I can't remember what they're calling them, but on the national level, they acknowledge that there are STEM careers, and we'll get this out to all of you as a PDF.
This is high school kids?
High school. This is all high school.
And this is all considered CTE?
Yep.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, because there's a national definition around the Perkins funding of what career and technical education is, and we need Brent probably to be a part of this.
Yes, and I think it's worth noting that there are plenty of CTE-like courses that aren't counted. You have to be in a high school that has selected an area and has gone through the functionally accreditation process. So this is probably a significant undercount if we're looking at education in these areas.
Yeah, these are in approved programs. So it's not, for example, your one-off computer science course or your horticulture course or something like that. It has to be a part of a state-approved program of study. So it's not just any elective courses that are also, that's another thing we have to wrestle with as a STEM council at some point is, computer science, and it's not fitting into
Well,
the way we
Elizabeth,
count things.
clarify for me, but I believe part of the approval process includes an articulation agreement with the community colleges.
That's true, isn't it, Louise?
If I can speak, yes.
Please, please.
Of course.
So it's not just high
Good.
school.
Can you
it's
clarify the
the
rest of it?
There's so many things, but most of us also know that there's just been a recently passed Associate of Science Oregon Transfer Computer Science degree, which
Yes.
we'll be working on pieces of what we need to do with that, but that's been approved by the HAC moving forward, but yes.
Yeah. It's at the high school computer science that is kind of
That's a little,
not currently an approved program of study yet.
So that's the end of this deck. I would say for this particular piece, Brent would self-describe the CTE as needs improvement with respect to data. They get it's a little archaic, it sounds like, in terms of the way that things are reported from schools to the department, et cetera, and a pretty cumbersome process to then interact with Brian Reeder and be able to create the federal reports. It sounds like a challenging deal. However, the fact that Brian Reeder has ever touched this and knows who these kids are means that he could throw that into his broader information about students, including their race, ethnicity, their attendance, their OAK scores, all of these things, and he could light up the room with information about the characteristics of kids that are in these programs that have taken these courses, and whether they go to college, and if they go to college, do they major in STEM degrees or all that kind of stuff. So, this is, I think, an area that has been a little data challenged in a corner of the department that with some attention you could learn an awful lot about these kids, how they're faring.
On the STEM degrees and the engineering degrees, do we have that by equity or by various?
Back.
Yeah, do we have any of that data?
We would for, I mean, not here today in my pocket,
Right.
but we would certainly for longitudinal data.
Data.
Yep. I will say, Jim, that when we looked at the class of 2006, high school graduating class of 2006, if I followed African American students coming out of Oregon high schools, I could not report the number who had graduated with a STEM degree as of 2012 because there were fewer than 6.
Out of the population, what's the percentage of the 40-some thousand kids that are
Yeah, couple percent. Yeah,
percent, so
1,000.
thousands, so less than?
It was 2%. They're getting a nationally.
For the
it's
total,
4%.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had
Slightly different.
I think you had about 1,000 African American students that would have been candidates, and fewer than 6. By 2000, now it doesn't mean that a few more would graduate later, but it was very small.
Yeah. Tiny.
And if you add Native American students to that, you're also looking at something.
And Latinos.
Yep. A huge issue.
But you would have the CTE data in the high school system by equity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you take what these folks have been, all these numbers here, Brian Reeder knows who these kids are,
Okay.
and so then you can go back and do all kinds
So
of
the question
demographics.
there is a disproportionate even at this level for the equity group.
Yeah.
That sounds like a priority question.
Yeah,
for
I mean, I
us.
think we do need to look at this because there may be just base discrimination in terms of they're not even getting the opportunity to get
Right.
exposed to this.
Oh, sure.
And
Where's
so
the
they need to
program?
track- there's no program.
Well, and on that line, it would be interesting to see the free and reduced lunch
Yep.
Yeah,
Yes,
with
no,
this,
that is
because when you get to the poorer schools,
Yeah.
they're maybe not going to have as many offerings.
Right. I mean, the other piece you could get even to the point, Mark made reference to this early on, that the high school graduation rates among the kids that touch CTE is considerably higher, 20, 30 percentage points higher. Not 30, but 20 percentage points higher than it is for non-CET kids. Some of that is just self-selection of the kids who are go into CTE were probably already headed, but I would bet that you could disentangle that some. And
Maybe because of school district too.
yeah, and but you could somebody like Brian Reeder could disentangle it and and find a CTE effect.
I think there's also another effect if we look at dropouts and,
Yeah.
and their mathematics achievement. So there's
Oh,
some
sure.
other national stuff on that, which is maybe something to dive into. So, thank you, John. I
You betcha.
appreciate
Yep.
that. That
Just out of
hopefully gives them.
curiosity, is the literature, the healthcare professions, does the literature show them to be STEM degrees or not STEM degrees? I know that's an ongoing.
Some say yes and some say no. One of the quintessential or one of the fundamental STEM reports in terms of labor supply and demand that came out of Georgetown a few years ago did not have healthcare as part of the definition, and people within the STEM community across the nation, or at least the network that I'm interacting with, tended to go, what the heck? You know, really? Why? You know, that doesn't make any sense at all. And when we actually dove into the ONET classifications for those, and pretty much you get down to the role of volunteer candy striper, but everything above that, you know, phlebotomist, you know, yes, it's a STEM degree, you know, or certificate. You know, you end up quickly saying that the vast majority in the healthcare profession, outside of some bureaucratical aspects of that profession, are certainly STEM related. So I would be really surprised if we did not include health care as part of that. Brenda, would you like to, we've got just a couple of your slides from the presentation that you gave last February to the STEM Investment Council in terms of the data that came out of your work.
Sure. So, gosh, it must have been 7 or 8 years ago we started. 7 or 8 years ago, we were asked to come up with a definition of STEM occupations. Yeah.
Someone else doing this?
Seth is.
Because I'm like, boy, I'm doing that really
The
well.
man behind the curtain, yeah. It was almost insane.
Great job, Laura.
Seth.
It's our new clicker. You just think it and it happens. You know?
That was fun to watch.
So here you go.
Ta-da. So we were asked to come up with a definition of STEM, and we just went out, and you know, it was so early in the STEM development that we went out nationally and looked for a definition of STEM. And what we found, I think it was the National Science Foundation, I think, was the original definition. It did not include healthcare at that time. And so anytime we would get asked over the last, up until the past year, over the 6 or so years for STEM, we would include kind of the standard computer, math, architects, engineers, scientists, type occupations. And then when I talked with Mark a year or so ago, he did his why not healthcare? And so then we added, of course, healthcare practitioners and technicians. Now, when you just said, you know, down to the candy striper, I took a quick look because we do have kind of 2 different sections of healthcare occupations in our data. And we included the higher level, but not the lower level. So I want to go back and even redefine and see where phlebotomist lies.
Oh, okay.
Because it might even be modified again after discussions here and whatnot. We might even add some more healthcare occupations.
So you have sort of management occupations, or are you including kind of business finance?
They are computer and information systems, architecture and engineering, and natural science
So it's
managers.
really sort of applied managers.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's just the ones that are
So
directly.
those are called management occupations in your
In
classification
our,
systems?
in our SOC codes, the managers are pulled out into a separate, you know, all managers fall into one two-digit, the first two-digit code. They're not down below with the rest of their similar occupations.
So you're pulling managers from those STEM occupations?
Yes.
The rest of them?
That are
Okay.
related, yes.
Yeah,
So there's only the 3 occupations.
that's good to know.
So every couple of years, we put together employment data at the employment department where we look at the current year's employment and then we look 10 years out for projections. We did this earlier this year, looking at 2012 and going out to 22. And just pulling the STEM data, this is where we end up with about 186,000 jobs in STEM occupations in 2012. Looking out 10 years, about a 17.7% growth rate, which is right about average. It was around 17% is average for all occupations. So it wasn't significantly higher or lower Go ahead and go to Laura. Would you like to try to click to the next slide?
Sure.
Just think it and see if you can make it happen.
It's not working for me. Oh, wait. Must have been.
So
Yeah.
in Oregon modeling, you're saying that it's tracking the average, essentially?
Yes.
The growth.
Yes. For our projections over 10 years, it's about average for STEM growth. Correct.
Versus non-STEM jobs?
Versus the total for all of Oregon. Yeah, it's
Total,
about
which
average.
inclusive.
Yeah, which would include STEM, but it
Which
is
is
just a small.
interesting.
It's about 10% of all jobs, or what we would call STEM jobs.
The reason I ask is that there's national reports that really make the claim that STEM jobs are growing at 2 to 3 times faster than non-STEM jobs.
And it
so
depends on
that's
how they're defining them too.
Yes, yeah.
There's
so-
STEM and STEAM and all different kinds of definitions
Yeah.
out there now. And if we do end up adding some more healthcare to our list, then that could increase it some too. Maybe not that much, but some. So looking at
So
individual.
back to that question. How did you calculate the increase for the 10 years? Is it just economic, just a trending number, or did you actually have some data? How did you get to the 10-year number?
So we have a lot of survey data that we collect from employers, plus we have tax record data. And we combine our surveys of employers where they're telling us what occupations they have in their industry with tax records where we know how many people are working in that industry. We combine those to come up with the number of people who are working in each occupation, how many jobs there are for the current year. Then we look 10 years out at any information that we can gather as far as trends go. What is industry telling us is going on in the future? We talk with different industry. We look at population. We look at the national numbers for growth. And we project out. And there's some other factors that come into play there too. How many people are going to be retiring? So we know how many openings there are, which doesn't affect the growth, but it still affects the number of openings. So we have a lot of information. We do the best that we can to look 10 years out.
So with your discussions with industry, did you say it doesn't include like if a new business opens up?
It
Do you have any
does,
predictions?
yes. The
Okay.
growth would include whether a new business is opening up. When we're talking to industry, we will talk to a manufacturing association and get their general comments on the trends that they see in their
Oh, I see.
industry. So we're not talking to each individual company as they're opening up.
I see the association. Okay.
But we are surveying on a regular basis and getting tax records on a regular basis from companies, so we can see those trends over time.
Tax records that you're giving, they do or do not include the stock codes?
No, they do
standard
not.
occupation?
Oh, I wish they did. Alaska is the only state that has that. We do not, and nobody else does.
Somebody mentioned to me just this week that the payroll actually does, the payroll records actually do have the stock codes. Do you know if that's true or not? We're in the weeds now, sorry, but yeah, the more accurate information would come from actually having the stock codes.
Well, I don't know about payroll. I'm not sure who would collect.
I don't know.
Hey, I
They
mean,
were just talking about
We through the
ADP.
excuse me, through the unemployment insurance tax records are the tax records that I'm talking about. And so they do tell us the total that they're paying individuals in their industry, but we don't know what their occupation is. And then our surveys that we do on a regular basis, where we're surveying employers, we are asking them what they're paying. That's where we get our wage data. So we're asking them what they're paying their workers, and we know what industry they're in. So we know that nurses in hospitals are getting an average pay of X amount, and we know how many nurses there are in hospitals total. And then we look the 10 years out to how many nurses we think there's going to be 10 years out. So we'll do 2014 to 22. It'll come out next year, actually.
Excellent.
No, I haven't So looking at the individual occupations, this looks like it's sorted by total openings. So that takes into account, so these are all of the STEM occupations, which there's, 60 or 80 or so STEM occupations in our definition. Sorting all of those by the most total openings. So those are openings both due to growth, so if a new business opens up, as well as replacement. If somebody leaves the occupation to retire or leaves for another reason to go to another occupation, that also creates an opening. So both the growth and the replacement out of all of the STEM occupations healthcare and computer come out on top with the most openings. So it's not so much, growth rate is one thing, how fast are things growing, but what we like to focus on is openings. How many people do we need newly trained to take these jobs? Whether it's a 5% growth rate or a 30% growth rate, if we need 10,000 people, we need 10,000 people. So that's where this is coming in. Yeah.
So these are the largest growing in these categories. Even if you're to throw in all occupations, these would be high up on your list, and there'd be a few other mixed in.
There would be others mixed in, and I don't have that list right handy.
But if we sort of looked at your top 50, we'd see a lot of this stuff going on. A lot of the
Yeah, I don't know how far down that would go, whether it be 50 or to 100 or how far down, but yes, there are definitely occupations with total openings of a couple, a handful.
Sure.
The anecdote there, Andrew, that your office
Oh, yeah,
put
yeah.
together employment stuff for us in the high wage, high demand. He sort of culled out the high wage, high demand piece. I sort of circled a few of them to look at. The 25 that were on there, I think 18 or 19 of them would fall under this list just by my eye. So maybe there's a plus or minus there, but
Okay.
it's roughly correlated, strongly correlated.
Yep.
Yeah, and as I recall, when you did this, I think the bottom of this cutoff was in like the 40th ranking or something like that, somewhere in the 40s.
So this is by SOC code. Each one of those occupations has a code associated with it, just like each one of the programs has a CIP, a CIP code associated with it. That's different, and we might talk about it later, than an ONET code. ONET actually has about 1,100 occupations total in their system. We have about 800 in our system. ONET actually has the same codes as ours, but in more detail. So they might take an occupation, all other managers, and whereas we have it listed as all other managers, and it's just kind of this dumping ground, they might have it broken out in ONET into 5 different types of managers. So they're not doing skills and all their information in ONET on all other managers. They're doing it on specific manager titles. So in some cases, some of these occupations, although most of these look pretty straightforward, but out of our 800, some of them are just kind of conglomerations of other occupations that are similar and grouped into these SOCs. We just don't have the resources to go out and collect on the tens of thousands of different occupational titles that are out there, so we use the...
But you sense that that's kind of the noise, sort of plus or minus 5%. If we went to that level of detail, do you think that we're missing a whole host of individuals, or is this close enough?
No, you'd be counting the same. That we actually don't have employment data based on ONET codes, and so that'd have to be another discussion. I just wanted to distinguish between ONET versus SOC. They're both occupational structures, but they're related but different. Okay.
Just so what's the SOC stand for?
Standard Occupational Classification. So in most cases here, replacement openings outweigh growth openings. So again, another reason not to look at just growth. While growth is very important, we also need to replace workers. We have a lot of baby boomers right now who put off their retirement because of the Great Recession, and now they're slowly starting to think more and starting to retire. And so whereas several years ago it was, this big bubble is coming and they're all going to leave, are we going to have enough workers? That bubble stuck around for a while, but now they're starting to retire. That bubble's still there, and that is definitely impacting the replacement openings. Healthcare practitioners, about half are growth and half are replacement. Computer occupations, there's more growth than replacement there, but it looks like the rest of them, there's more replacement than growth. You have a question?
I do, but it's moving on beyond this subject area, so I don't want to...
Okay. Are there any questions on this before we move on? Go for it.
Did you do any wage analysis of how these particular STEM-related occupations compare in wages to other occupations that require the same level of education?
No, but we certainly could.
I just wonder if that's where you might see the difference in terms of the benefit of going into a STEM occupation. I know nationally that data is there.
Yeah. and Oregon Business Council put forward in a report of Oregon Learns, which I thought
Right.
that your shop had done the
Couple
wage
years ago.
differential.
Yeah.
And
There is one.
yeah. and it's something like
Thanks, Captain Obvious. That was awesome.
I mean, I'll look back on it.
Yeah, the wage differential that I recall averages to 25%.
Yeah.
It's a bit higher in the actually the high school graduates because I believe I surmise that they're the ones leaving high school and going into computer science because they don't need a degree to be successful in those fields. Actually, I mean, but I don't know. That's just the way I read it. It was like a 40% differential. I was like, really, just for a high school graduate?
The report that I've read is 10% on average, but still it's significant.
Yeah, we
increase
should.
in wages.
So there's a question.
So then there's corollary of looked at sort of the long-term returns to different degree types, and there's a strong corollary in return by degree types, and it basically boils down to STEM, finance, and then economics and the social science side that have sort of strongly higher remuneration over a lifetime. So there's a pretty good balance.
Is that the payscale.com?
No, it's actually I think it was the Georgetown.
Okay.
George.
Take it out of my stack.
So this is one of those economic arguments and data is what is the impact to our economy should we double the number of STEM degrees in the high demand areas, not just doubling the environmental sciences.
The fundamental question is, will those jobs get filled irrespective of whether we graduate enough kids in Oregon to fill those jobs? I mean, back to the question, are we trying to get Oregonians to fill these jobs? Or are we going to, because Intel's going to fill their jobs, they're going to fill them. And now whether they come from Oregon or they come from other states that are producing excess of what they need, I don't know.
Right, and that's where I would caution us against trying to get too specific. I think we're trying to hit the side of the barn, not come in the window of.
Yeah.
And with this information, I think this information is absolutely critical. I would put it in the category of almost the known knowns, at least with respect to replacement. But there are some things we do know, and we've got this kind of, this is solid. But I think we have this vast set of unknown unknowns about what the economy is going to look like in the next 15 years. And so we're trying to speculate, how do we set up this workforce to be as flexible and nimble as they can be for an economy that we can't conceive of. Probably the most famous or telling piece that I can recall being quoted was Bill Clinton had a workforce summit in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1992, right after he was elected, and brought in all these top industry thinkers and really bright folks, and there's a lot of bright things said, but nowhere in the transcript was the word the internet. And that was 3 years before it really took off. So it's I think
economic data completely trumps, all of this is noise compared to the changes in the larger economic picture, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Kind of going to some of the stuff you were talking about, also just the charge that you talked about, Mark, in terms of what is the state of the system that we're trying to change. There's a research construct that's called STEM identity, which is how, and so I think one of the things is that culture. How do I relate to STEM? And I think changing that culture within the schools is something we might really think about, whether or not we could measure that and what that might look like, because that's going to impact Oregon kids. So.
And Portland Metro STEM Partnership and others have done some great work on that front. So it is a very critical construct. It's not just the academic success that is actually, in fact, it tends not to be.
It's
the academic component is a piece of one's identity and then later pathways, but it's not the dominant one. They don't stay in those careers unless they're loving it, and it goes back to one's sort of their motivation, inspiration, how their relationship, their identity that matters most.
And not to get on a soapbox, but one of the problems I had with the STEM Coalition's work, and I didn't mind seeing it, but they were talking about all the great value to the economy if we double the degrees, we're going to have all this. Well, you got to have jobs. You got to have an economy. You got to have businesses here that want to use those people. So, you know, you can't just assume it's going to happen. You got to have an economy that supports it. So, but clearly there's demand, and we don't produce enough Oregon graduates to fill these jobs right now. I mean, the numbers are pitiful. I think this works out to 70,000 jobs over 10 years. Divide that by 10, you get about 7,000 a year. We might produce 2,000 or 3,000 out of our system. So these jobs are getting filled, but they're either going to not get filled and the companies are going to move, which means you're going to lose income, or they're going to get filled by other people, because kids will fill these, the companies will find their workers, and Oregonians will be left on the sidelines without these good jobs. So
the business folks that I've talked to aren't worried. I mean, they'll support the pipeline metaphor and that argument, saying, yes, we'd love to hire locally. They will, but ultimately they don't care. The biggest piece for them is, how do we attract talent here and retain talent here? And so that gets into the economic conversation. What is the business environment like? What are the local schools like? Can I draw that PhD student from Harvard and keep her here, doing that work? That's a more complex little story to tell the legislature.
But I will tell you, many people choose not to come here if they look at the education system. They're not pleased with what they see, or vice versa. They may like it, and they self-select as they move here.
Yeah, but that's a bit nuanced for what we're probably
to me, that's the second order of what we're doing here. I still
that is
come
going
back
through
to
the window.
These are opportunities for Oregon students, and we got to fill the pipeline, and we're not. And those children are being lost on the sidelines for the opportunity to earn jobs, and they probably would stay here if they got those jobs.
I mean, the condition of the K-12 in general is a little nuanced, but you can go back to Intel's original press release when they decided to break ground in Oregon, and they cited 4 or 5 things that drove them, and the K-12 system was one of them. I would be surprised if you had some kind of major employer move into Oregon and list K-12 among the reasons that they would come here. Now,
we're going to change that. That's what we're here about.
That's we are.
Anyway, it's a little soapbox.
So, given that there's a few, that we've got a couple of minutes left, I would like to talk about one. I've captured a lot of the questions that have arisen. I would love for you to continue to noodle on those kinds of essential questions, either about the state of the system or about just things that you think that we need to know in order to feed into the strategic conversations, or things that, I have heard this, and we want to validate them in some fashion so that we are working from good, strong assumptions. And then, just other things that just arise from your own curiosity, and we'll end up sorting through those and refining those through our email exchanges. But please do try to capture those questions, because they're all critical thinkers.
We've just focused on STEM degrees here. What about 4th and 8th grade math proficiency? We need to look at some data in that area too. And whether it's the new math testing, I'm not the
Smarter
educator.
Balance, yeah.
Yeah, what is the right testing mechanism, or what do the numbers look like? Because we're going to have to get smart on
Right now,
4th
we're
and 8th.
going to stick with the NAEP probably for a nationally normed test. It's unless somebody else has a more valid instrument that they're aware of, and we can get Brian.
We need to get that data and bring that
I
back.
actually have several of those. In addition, I think we could look at so the
SAT,
4th and 8th
ACT.
grade, and then advanced placement would be kind of interesting. How many of our kids are taking advanced placements, STEM related, and we're way off the mark of a number of other states in terms of share of kids that attend that.
Particularly in computer science.
Yeah.
One of the things I'll just share with the group, one of the things that I'm interested in doing is expanding the STEM definition beyond that of advanced placement students who are already very successful. And so, thinking about the equity lens and how we drive down the definition of STEM so that anybody can connect with that identity, and build that. So I think AP would be great, but I think there could be other measures for us to think about.
Yep.
And it's not always academic prowess. So, although that's important.
Well, do think we need to, often in conversations I've been involved with around sort of these topics or in education, there's been sort of an agnosticism to like all paths are the right path. I think that we need to break that down and say some paths aren't as good as other paths. So these are the kinds of paths that prepare students for high-wage jobs, or the kinds of paths that prepare our labor force to meet the demands of the 21st century.
I don't want us to put
That's
that kind of a
job.
judgment on good or bad.
Well,
I
think
would say perhaps these are the more appropriate ones that lead to this, but not that they're good or bad.
Well,
But could
I mean,
we-
that's fine, but I do think that we just, like, if we expand definitions.
If we marry data to those,
Mhm.
if we could say
That's
these paths are going to give you a higher wage in
Mhm.
Oregon, you know, at all sorts of different levels. I mean, would you be comfortable with that? Because I
Yeah,
think that's exciting.
Yeah,
to me.
that's great. But I just don't want us to get into, and this happens with STEM, or in, we aren't saying that literature degrees are bad.
No, not at all.
Or that,
Some
chemistry
of my
degrees
best
are
friends have
good.
literature.
Yeah, so,
Thanks for sharing.
so that's just it. I mean, seeing the data and saying, yeah, this is exactly what will lead you to that, absolutely. Absolutely.
So maybe the way to think about it is we have a pretty high concentration of certain kinds of degrees in Oregon. We produce
Forestry, perhaps?
We produce lots of them, and we attract a lot of them, and I'm not going to name any of them.
Baristas.
Brewers, that was on the list, yeah.
Oh,
And
never
I
bitches.
think if you look at sort of these math engineering, they're lower down the list in terms of both production and people just moving here. And that this exercise is really trying to bring some balance back to the broad workforce in terms of skill. Not so you don't have to attack the other ones. You say we've got a pretty big supply,
Right.
both resident, because people with those kinds of degrees are attracted to the state and this city. Our institutions are producing even more of those, and so we just need to bring up this side that seems to be out of balance a little bit.
So you raise a really good meta question. Both of you really said similar things. Is how do we feed information, labor market information, back into the system so that students can make informed choices, and parents in terms of guidance, as well as our system responding. Right. So I think those are two pieces of how do we get information flowing so that the system itself and the individuals within that system can make informed choices.
Well, it just so happens. Starting in February, we have about a dozen workforce analysts that work in the research section of the employment department. And right now, they primarily work with businesses and employers and making sure they have the labor market information that they need. Starting in February, we are going to shift and not be just businesses, but be educators and businesses.
Great.
So that's a huge thing that we're working on right now, and that is to make sure that exactly what you just said.
Nice.
So that'll be starting in February.
Wow, that's
When
great.
I've seen John's chart with supply demand and where it is striking in terms of what it is. We're producing more in the liberal arts section and not enough in the science section. And just this idea of balancing, do kids understand that if they go in those fields, it can be tougher to find a job than in other fields? And just going with your eyes wide open when you go to college, just so you know what you're getting into.
Or think about bringing it together, because if you have a literature degree with a minor in economics, there's a lot of places to take that,
Career paths.
So next steps here, in terms of looking at the next 3 months, or at least the next meeting of this group, this subcommittee meeting. How frequently should we meet? Monthly, weekly, bi-monthly. We need to talk about that. What are some of the highest priority issues that we want to tackle, at least this next one, if not the next two, so that we can start teeing up the necessary, the expertise. Who else could or should be at the table in this conversation as well? So those two questions. What are our top priorities to focus this work? And then who else should be at the table, for this conversation?
So I have a bit of a suggestion.
Yeah.
Is that we have a framing document that lays out what the group is, the several sort of key goals that we need to achieve. I mean, I think this has been a great conversation and sort of teed up what is out in the ether, but without sort of a framing document to hold this group's task together, well, I think we'll admire problems.
Basically a charter.
Yeah, charter.
Charter with members and stuff like that. I think that'd be
Yeah.
helpful. And I do think we
I
need to
already have
get
that, so I'll
real,
send it out to you.
at least in the next couple times, we got to get clear on what at least the two metrics we are and what they are. I mean, we got to know what is a STEM degree and how we're going to count it and where we stand, what's the baseline, just the basic blocking and tackling on STEM degrees. So we agree on what that is, and then on 4th and 8th grade math, what it is and where we are. I mean, those are the two we know, and then we can figure out what adds into that and other metrics. But we've got to get those two, at least as a starting point.
Yeah, well, it might take a couple meetings for us to agree on.
Yeah,
what
right.
those
Those
are.
two ought to be the
And the
first.
end goal is we're going to answer those two questions.
We have to answer those
and
questions,
say,
yeah.
we're going to double it from, we're going to decide it's X now, and it's going to be Y, and this is what it would mean to double the proficiency in 4th and 8th grade.
And define what it is, whether it's Oregonians or whatever it is.
Well, and along those same lines, I don't know if we have the opportunity to make any amendments to the legislation if we had data. I don't know. No.
That takes an awful big lift. I think what we want to make sure is that we have plenty of time, I think, to modify the legislation. I think what we want to do is define the right thing so that we can guide that conversation with legislators. So I don't think we should go in this session and do anything.
We can always add more metrics that we want to measure and watch. We can always add more.
We can add more.
We can add more. There's nothing that says as watching our progress. These are other things we want to observe in the ecosystem to see how it's affecting the overall outcome on math scores and STEM degrees. And there may be leading indicators that we've got to watch. These are kind of lagging, frankly. These are lagging indicators because after that point, you're too late to fix the problem. I mean, to get 4th and 8th grade math to change, you don't worry about 4th grade and 8th graders. You've got to get upstream, way upstream. And we need some leading indicators in the early session, both for STEM degrees and this 4th and 8th grade math of what do you got to do at kindergarten, what do you got to do at 1st grade, what is the career path so you get to the success we're looking for at the outcome. So.
Well, and with that, I think we also need to look at the different levels of work, right? Because if you're expecting to impact student achievement, you need to look at how you're impacting changes at the classroom level.
Yeah.
And the only way to affect changes at the classroom level is to be able to have access to that data to feed back into the classroom, right? So you're never going to advance student achievement without advancing improvement at the classroom level. So it's one thing to look at NAEP scores or OAKS tests. That's not going to provide any kind of feedback loop to evoke the change that we're looking for.
Proximal enough to the
So
work.
what metrics do we need to recommend that are either there or needs to be developed to provide that kind of formative assessment?
And the STEM hubs are wrestling with those questions. So those will filter back to this group as well. So we've got a lot of work that's going on simultaneously, and that the practitioner work is really critical for that.
So because many of these things impact the education system, I hate to say it, and we don't have any educators, pure educators from the K through 12. You have community college, you're community college, right? We have anyone from K-12 educator?
I'm post-secondary, but I have my degree in science education.
I'm looking for someone from the education.
Currently.
Currently.
So the department at the education system, like the Department of Education, who looks with educational data.
Educational data that helps us. I mean, I don't know where data all exists.
We can get Brian Remar.
Yeah, we need to have someone who knows that education, the K through 12 education stuff.
Brian would be under one.
Okay.
I know the K-12.
Okay, you got it.
I was the director of enterprise systems at Oregon Department of Education before I moved to Oregon Education.
Is that data available to you then?
Yes.
Well, yeah, and our research group, which
Yes.
Mark and I was part of, we work directly with Brian Reeder at ODE, and we pull from the same data sources. So we're here.
Okay, good. I didn't know if we had access to it. That's what I was trying to understand.
We do.
Going back to the earlier point, we don't have any formative assessments, say, in mathematics
Early
at
on.
the state level. Period.
Period.
Period at the state level.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
The one place that we may need to go later is the early learning work in terms of early learning data, depending on how far upstream we want to
Yeah.
go. And I'll send out to this group some interesting reports from the Education Research Council for the states, or
Education Commission.
ERC, yeah. Research Commission for the states, ECS.
ECS.
Educational
Yeah,
Commission. of the
ECS,
States.
not ERC.
Let's just
All right,
yeah.
ECS,
We need more
yes.
acronyms, don't we?
There's two reports. One is around early science experiences, and the other one is really around early mathematics competency, around patterning, number sense, etc. And there's a lot of talk and research around third grade literacy scores and being a critical thing, and they are critical for the system. It's very fascinating to see that early mathematics understanding is a much stronger predictor of student success and of literacy than the third grade reading scores. So,
Interesting. Well, I was wondering if there was a nexus there.
We've got some
argue
messaging to do.
put them together. If you put third grade reading and STEM experiences together at the early learning stage, you might have a powerful model that then gets everyone excited about it, not just for STEM degrees, but for third grade reading.
sure, and certainly every young student is a STEM professional, right? In terms of their curiosity, creativity, their willingness to take risks, take experiments, etc.
So you can integrate that into what they're trying to do at third grade reading, kind of make that, so we can integrate that, that would be a powerful.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm hearing we're going to wrestle with definitions and SIP and SOC codes next time, and we're going to be looking at what is the STEM degree, how are we going to count it, and the math and science scores issues.
And a
I
charter.
heard another one, a data need. So enrolling in AP or I assume international baccalaureate classes, really interesting. And
Yeah,
so
we can do that.
We need skip codes as well.
Yeah, I actually have the national reports. So
You've already got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then a charter, we probably should agree on.
Yeah. Right.
And I think maybe, given the time, probably mid to late January would be a good time for another get-together, or something like that.
Yeah, probably will be hard before the next STEM council meeting.
Yeah, so maybe-
So it'll probably be late January.
Late January.
It's,
In that charter, could you put in some, maybe moving, but, benchmarks in terms of deadlines, what you'd like us to have done by a certain time frame, so I know what your goal is for me?
yeah, some of it's going to be a bit. That's a good point. The subcommittee work. We're looking at putting a work plan in place to at least till June, knowing that the landscape is going to be changing with these three. This dynamic between the strategic planning of work and activities and this work needs to dovetail prior to June. So it'll be interesting, as we go forward. It'll be some iterations and maybe even some joint meetings. So thank you, John. Appreciate that. Do we have anybody signed up for public testimony? Okay. So in that case, Sheriff, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you all for your participation. This is going to be this is going to be fun. I think this is going to be good stuff, and we need this data to help monitor what we're doing. It's going to be very helpful.
Yes. Thank you all. And if you have questions in the meantime that you're thinking of and curious about, send them our way and we'll put them into the hoppers. Right? Yeah.
If I remember this one.